Do you believe that a stranger could walk into your home and heal what money, doctors, and even time could not? Richard Alton, known as one of the coldest billionaires in America, had twin children. But no one had ever heard them laugh. They didn't speak. They didn't walk. They didn't hug. After their mother's sudden death, it was as if the twins had vanished from the world even though they were still alive. Then, one day, Richard noticed something unusual. The new housekeeper was out in the garden. She wasn't teaching. She wasn't forcing them to eat. She was just sitting there, beside the children, whispering something he couldn't hear. But that single moment changed everything. If it were you, a father, standing helpless in front of two children, silent as statues, what would you do? Stay on the outside or place your hope in a stranger? This isn't just a story about children or about a housekeeper. It's a story about life being awakened again, about love spoken without words, and about a family not born by blood but chosen by the heart. If you believe that miracles sometimes come from the smallest acts, hit like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this journey. Now take a deep breath and listen to how the impossible became possible. While most kids were learning to walk in sunlit parks or grassy backyards, Caleb and Elise Alton were learning not to move. Inside a mansion spanning over 12,000 square feet, the 4-year-old twins of the Hamptons' most famous billionaire family didn't talk, didn't run, and most haunting of all, didn't laugh, and standing quietly on the second-floor balcony, looking down at the perfectly trimmed lawn where his daughter carefully lined up pebbles in a row, Richard Alton couldn't tell if he was grieving or simply hiding. Richard Alton, 54, was the embodiment of the American billionaire, tall, broad-shouldered, white, his silver hair groomed as neatly as every detail of his life. Founder and CEO of Alton Capital, a New York-based financial empire. He was once called the cold brain of Wall Street, but everyone who worked for him knew one unspoken rule: never mention the name Eleanor. Because ever since the day Eleanor, his wife, died in a car accident 2 years earlier, Richard's heart had gone with her. And from that day on, he stopped smiling, just like his children, Caleb and Elise. Biracial twins, Eleanor was Filipino-American, had soft brown skin, dark eyes, and thick, gently curled hair. Each was different. Elise loved sunlight and stones. Caleb curled beneath the red maple tree, silent as a shadow. After their mother's death, the twins stopped developing. They didn't speak, they didn't walk, they didn't respond. Every leading doctor had been brought in: psychologists, physical therapists, behavioral specialists, and every conclusion was the same. The children weren't broken. They had simply shut the world out. They're not physically harmed. Their souls have just closed the door. Dr. Rowan, child behavioral therapist. Richard tried. He read to them. He brought them outside. But every time he looked into Elise's eyes, he saw Eleanor, her smile, her gaze, and he would retreat. One cold March morning, before spring had arrived, Richard went into the garden. The children sat opposite each other, not looking at him, not even at each other. Elise drew circles in the sand with a twig. Caleb stared into the air, unblinking. "Do you want pancakes?" Richard asked softly. No answer, no movement, only the wind carried away a paper crane left on the stone table. He turned back inside, silent. They were right. He was a genius in finance, but a failure as a father. In just 2 years, more than 23 nannies, nurses, therapists, and staff had come and gone. Some gave up after weeks. Some Richard fired for what he called their pathetic, pitying looks. Most simply couldn't endure the atmosphere inside that house. Until one day, a simple application appeared not from an agency, just a thin folder written in clean handwriting, Maria Reyes, 39 years old, Mexican, petite, brown-skinned, long black hair tied low, experience in orphanages and Catholic schools, no advanced degrees, no therapy certifications, just one request to be near children. At the bottom, one quiet note made Richard pause. I am not here to heal. I am only here to stay beside them. Something about that line stopped him, not because it impressed him, but because it wasn't another hollow promise. The day Maria arrived, she carried only a worn leather bag and a small wooden box filled with paper cranes. She wore a simple white blouse, scuffed shoes. She didn't chatter, didn't rush, just bowed her head gently and said, I don't want to make any promises. Mr. Alton. Richard studied the woman in front of him, bronze skin, steady brown eyes, and felt something, maybe doubt, maybe hope. He nodded. I don't need promises. Just don't make things worse. Maria smiled faintly. Would it be all right if I start in the kitchen? That day, no one inside the mansion knew that something had begun to shift. Quietly, without sparkle or noise, just step by step, breath by breath, at exactly 6 o'clock, when the mansion's clock chimed and a thin veil of fog still clung to the lavender rose by the porch. Maria Reyes was already awake. She wasn't a noisy woman. She didn't knock on doors or call out loudly. Instead, she moved quietly through the house, boiled water, and began her morning by wiping each glass door, each staircase railing, as if they were living things that needed to be soothed. No one in the house paid much attention. The housekeeper usually arrived late. The children's private nurse was long accustomed to silence, and no one ever questioned why the coffee was already brewed, the toast crisped just right, or why the flowers in the vases were always fresh. Maria simply observed. She didn't ask for Caleb and Elise's medical records. She didn't research diagnoses or therapy plans. She didn't rush in with forced enthusiasm like all the others before her. Instead, she was present. She often sat beneath the red maple tree where Caleb liked to curl up like a small cat quietly folding paper cranes. When Elise wandered outside, Maria never called to her. She simply drew circles in the dirt with a twig, the same way Elise often did. At first, the girl didn't notice, but by the third time, Elise's gaze lingered just for a heartbeat longer. One early morning, Maria spotted Caleb fumbling with a watering can inside the little greenhouse. Instead of rushing to help, she stayed back and whispered softly, slowly but steady. The boy never turned around, but that day, the watering can was placed back in its spot, not broken. Richard noticed all of this through the security cameras. Suspicious of Maria's unusual calm, he had his assistant install extra wide-angle cameras around the back garden. He wanted to know why the children weren't recoiling from her presence the way they had with everyone else. But after a week, the footage showed nothing unusual, just a small woman drifting quietly through the house, never pushing, never coaxing, never doing anything remarkable. And yet, that was the most remarkable thing of all. During a staff meeting, Richard asked Elise's private nurse directly, "Does she ever touch the children?" "No, sir. She just stays near them. She doesn't talk to them, only when necessary, and never too many questions. But the strange thing is the children don't shut down around her. They don't resist." Richard said nothing. He hated ambiguity. In finance, everything was measurable, profit or loss, rise or fall, invest or withdraw. But Maria, she was an equation with no numbers, a silence he couldn't calculate. Then, one late afternoon, after finishing a Zoom meeting with the board, Richard stepped onto his balcony and froze. Caleb was standing, not held up, not carried, standing on his own. He wasn't walking, but for Richard, it looked like a miracle. Maria was nearby, her back turned, knitting a scarf with dark brown yarn. She didn't look at him, didn't clap, didn't cheer. She simply sat there, as though she trusted something was unfolding in its own time. Elise sat beside her brother, not drawing circles that day. Instead, she watched him, and for the first time in 2 years, her dark eyes flickered with something different, a glimmer, a spark of light breaking through. Richard's hand gripped the balcony railing. His heart pounded, but his mind sneered. It's probably just a reflex. Don't get your hopes up. And yet, that night, for the first time in months, he didn't take his sleeping pills. The next morning, as he stepped into the kitchen for coffee, he found Maria pouring herself tea. She looked up and smiled faintly. Yesterday was beautiful, wasn't it? Richard gave a slow nod. What are you doing with the children? Nothing, Maria replied, still smiling. I'm just giving them a space to be themselves. He opened his mouth to press further, but something about the quiet between them, with sunlight spilling through the kitchen window, stopped him. For once, he didn't want to break the peace. He lingered longer than usual, and as he turned to leave, Maria quietly placed a paper crane on the table. It was red, the color of hope. Not too bright, not demanding, the color of rebirth, waiting to be named. It's strange. Isn't it? Some changes arrive without warning. No sound, no words. Just one early autumn morning, before sunlight touched the doorstep. Richard stood on the second-floor balcony, black coffee steaming in his hand, and froze. On the lawn below, Caleb, the boy who used to sit curled up for hours, was bending down to pick up a fallen red maple leaf. He held it up to the light, studying it, and in his dark, usually vacant eyes something shifted, a flicker thin as a whisper of wind at dawn. He didn't say a word, but that tiny hand lifted the leaf high, as if he wanted to show it to someone. No one was there, except Maria. She was tending to white chrysanthemums in the corner of the garden. She didn't look at him. And yet, Caleb walked closer. He didn't touch her, just stood one step away and held out the leaf. Maria kept watering the flowers, then gently placed a hand on his head, a quiet, stroke-like touching silence as it was being born. No praise, no applause. But Caleb's eyes, for the first time, Richard saw them answer, a reaction, a connection. Richard's grip on his coffee trembled. His heartbeat slowed, heavy in his chest. Something was truly changing. That night, Elise dreamed. She sat up in her bed, drenched in sweat. Usually, she screamed or hit her pillow, but this time, she whispered a single word of, as breath, Mom. The cameras almost missed it. Richard replayed the clip 4 times. On the 5th, he broke down, collapsing on the edge of his bed, face in his hands. He remembered Grace, her laughter, the way she stroked Elise's hair each night, the way she held Caleb when he whimpered. Grace had been the light of this house, and when she left, everything died. But now the children were stirring again, a little, fragile, but real. One morning, Maria was folding linens at the table when Elise wandered in, quiet as always. No one called her. She reached into her dress pocket and shyly placed a lavender sprig in Maria's hand. Maria looked at the tiny, wrinkled flower and smiled. Not the smile of a housekeeper, the smile of someone who had just been given an entire world. Elise didn't speak, but her eyes met Maria's trembling, unafraid, like a child touching water for the first time and realizing it isn't cold. A few days later, rain trickled softly outside. Maria sat on the porch, trimming vegetables for lunch. Caleb sat beside her, and for the first time, he reached out and plucked away a wilted leaf, dropping it into the basket. His small hand shook, but it was steady. Maria turned to him, said nothing, just nodded, and Caleb smiled, faintly, but unmistakably. Richard gasped from behind the glass doors. He saw everything, and inside him, something shattered. Not fear, but the wall. The wall he had built stone by stone to shield his heart from hope. Now, it was breaking. That evening, he waited by the door as Maria prepared to leave. "Have you ever had children?" he asked suddenly. Maria was silent for a long time, her deep brown eyes still as a lake before dawn. "Yes," she said at last, "but not any more." Richard lowered his gaze. Words failed him. That's why Maria continued softly, "I understand. Some children don't need words to call someone home." The sentence pierced him. His throat tightened. For the first time, Richard began to believe not with reason, but with something deeper, soul deep. The next morning, Maria stepped out to find a paper crane on the doorstep. Clumsy, uneven folds, dark blue. Elise couldn't fold. Caleb couldn't either. But someone had watched, had learned, had left it there, a thank you, unspoken, a sign that life had returned. Maria picked it up gently, pressed it to her chest, and bowed her head as if receiving something sacred. This was no longer work. This was resurrection. Nights in the Hamptons were always quiet. But inside Richard Alton's chest, nothing was at peace. This was the man who could authorize hundreds of millions with a single nod, yet had no idea how to nod to himself. He sat alone in the library. A glass of wine, untouched, had gone warm on the table. Above him, a yellow lamp spilled light over dusty picture frames, one of them a family photo taken in Italy. Grace beaming, holding their children in her arms. Elise sticking her tongue out at her father. Caleb hiding shyly behind his mother's skirt. Back then. Richard thought, "I am the happiest man in the world." Now, staring at that photo, he didn't know what to feel. Since Grace's death, Richard had never cried. Not because he wasn't in pain, but because he was afraid. Afraid that if he collapsed, he'd never stand up again. The world expected him to be Richard Alton, the billionaire who never breaks. But no one cared for Richard, the husband who had lost his wife, until the children began to change, until Maria appeared. No promises. No grand plan, just a quiet presence that made life flow again, like a river released from a dam. Richard set his glass down and rose to his feet. In the hallway, he paused outside the kitchen. Inside, Maria was writing something on paper. Elise sat beside her, holding a blue crayon. Across the table, Caleb was carefully folding a paper boat. They didn't see him standing there, and perhaps that was better. He turned away in silence. The next morning, Richard skipped the office. Instead, he took Elise and Caleb for a walk in the back garden, the first time since Grace's funeral. The twins stayed close. Elise held her brother's hand. while Caleb carried a little notebook Maria had given him. The book of things you see. Daddy. Elise whispered, so softly he almost thought he imagined it. She hadn't spoken since Grace died. He froze. Then Elise lifted her clear, dark eyes. Do you miss Mom? Richard's breath caught. The question pierced him like a blade. He knelt down, placed his hands on her shoulders. Yes, I miss her very much. He choked out. For the first time, aloud, Elise didn't cry. She leaned her head against his shoulder. Caleb sat in the grass, drawing a drifting cloud. In the picture were 3 figures, a man with brown hair, a little girl with a ponytail, and a woman with long silver hair standing together on that cloud. Maria had taught him how to tell stories without words. That afternoon, Richard did something he'd never done before he invited Maria to sit and eat with them. A simple meal chicken soup, toasted bread, chamomile tea. She hesitated at first, but Richard said gently, I just want to thank you. Maria met his eyes, silent, but the silence was warmer than words. Richard realized he didn't know how to begin. Only that since she had arrived, the house had begun to breathe again. No more suffocating silence, no more hollow stares. Even he, the man who lived like stone, was softening inch by inch. A week later, Richard received an invitation to the annual charity gala in New York. Once, he'd been the face of that stage, but not since Grace's funeral. This time, he went. With Caleb and Elise at his side, the host announced tonight, we welcome Richard Alton, founder of the Grace for Tomorrow Foundation, supporting children with developmental challenges. Richard stepped onto the stage, the twins beside him. The hall went silent. He looked out at the hundreds of faces, his eyes rimmed red, his hand trembled. I once believed, he began, voice low, that losing the person you love most is the worst thing that can happen. But worse than that is not knowing how to keep living for the ones left behind. A long pause, and then he glanced at Caleb, then Elise. I realize sorrow doesn't kill us. What kills us is closing our hearts, locking everyone out, denying ourselves the right to be vulnerable. He drew a breath. There was a woman who came into my home, not to make my children speak, but to remind us that silence is also a language, and that hope doesn't always need words. The entire hall rose to its feet, applause thundering. Elise clutched his hand tighter. Caleb bowed his head, smiling shyly, that night when they returned home. Maria was on the porch, knitting in the quiet. Richard walked over and laid a single white rose on the table. Thank you for bringing us back to life. Maria rested her hand on the flower, her gaze steady. It wasn't me, she said softly. It was you, all of you, who chose to live again. Richard nodded, his eyes wet, and for the first time in years, Richard Alton allowed himself to cry. Not out of weakness, but out of gratitude. It was Monday morning. Richard had just finished a video call with shareholders in London when his private secretary walked in with an ivory envelope. No return address, no postmark, just a careful line written across the front, to Richard Alton, private. Richard frowned. Few people ever dared to send handwritten letters directly to his Hamptons estate. He set down his coffee, slowly opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, thin, faintly scented with age, the handwriting soft but steady. Richard, have you ever wondered if you've been too busy to see what truly matters? I don't blame you. But I will say this, Caleb and Elise are not silent because they don't know how to speak. They are silent because they are listening to the things you never say. I know this because I once was a child like them. If you want to understand your children, you must first understand yourself. Someone who once lived in the shadow of men like you. No signature. Richard read the letter again and again. Each word struck his chest like a hammer. That line, I once was a child like them. It haunted him all afternoon. He told no one. But that night, he couldn't sleep. Instead, he went down to the storage room, pulling out boxes filled with old family photographs, Grace's letters, even memos from the early days of Alton Capital, back when it was a cramped Brooklyn office. What was he looking for? He couldn't say. Only that something deep inside urged him on. And then, near it hit him. He knew that handwriting. He had seen it before, almost 20 years ago, in the application of a scholarship child from the Alton Hope Foundation, a Latina girl, long black hair, sad brown eyes. Her name was Maria Reyes. Richard froze. The next morning, as Maria flipped pancakes in the kitchen, he walked in. For a long moment, he just watched her, those same hands, quick and steady, turning each piece of batter into golden rounds. Maria. His voice was low, almost hesitant. "Can I ask you something?" She turned, eyes calm but guarded. "Did you once receive the Alton Hope Scholarship?" Maria set the spatula down, wiped her hands on her apron, and gave a small nod. Yes. Richard's breath caught. He had never made the connection that the quiet woman in his home was the same girl whose name had once crossed his desk. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Maria held his gaze. Her voice was steady. "Because I didn't want gratitude to build a wall between us. I came here for your children, not to collect the past." He swallowed. His next question came softly. "And the letter was at you?" She didn't answer directly. Didn't deny it either. "Some truths," she said quietly, "don't need to be spoken to be understood." Her words stayed with him all day, circling in his mind. Richard realized, with a pang, that he had never once asked about her life, the woman who cooked for his children, who kept his home steady, who had somehow breathed air back into this lifeless mansion. He had never looked beyond her silence. That evening, he asked her to sit with him on the back porch, where Grace once loved the old swing. "Maria," he said gently, "I want to hear, if you're ready to tell me." For a long time, she looked at him, then she nodded. "I grew up in South Bronx. My mother cleaned offices at night. My father was deported when I was 6. I was smart, but nobody believed I could escape that world. Until your scholarship, that was the first time I sat in a classroom with a desk that wasn't broken, with books that weren't torn, with a lunch that didn't have to be split in two." Her voice was even, but her eyes shimmered. "But I never really belonged there. I could feel it. People were kind, but only out of pity. Not because they believed I deserved it." Richard said nothing. Something inside him cracked. "When I finally graduated, I had a chance at college, but my mother got sick. So I dropped everything, worked any job I could to keep her alive. 10 years later, I found myself here." He listened. Every word sank deep. "So, when I see your children silent, afraid, closed off, I understand. I can't erase their pain, but I can walk beside them, the way someone should have walked beside me." Richard lowered his head. His voice was rough. "Maria, you've taught me something, that helping people isn't just about money. It's about showing up, being there, with your whole heart. Maria smiled faintly. That's what Grace did. I only learned it from her. Later that night, Richard peeked into Caleb's room. The boy was fast asleep, hugging his old stuffed deer. On the desk lay an open notebook. A simple drawing filled the page, one large hand shielding two smaller ones. Underneath, scrawled in uneven pencil letters, were the words, "Family doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to stay." Richard felt his chest tighten. Tears slipped down his face. This time, he didn't wipe them away, because sometimes tears are the only way to finally say what the heart has carried in silence for far too long. The skies over Connecticut had turned to lead, gray clouds drifting silently across a washed-out horizon. Inside the vast, walnut-paneled study of the Alton estate, Richard sat alone at his desk. In front of him, a cold cup of coffee and a crumpled, time-worn letter, the paper yellowed, edges fragile. It was Eleanor's handwriting, a letter she had written to him long ago, but never sent. Maria had found it tucked inside an old notebook, hidden in a fabric box beneath the twins' pillows. Richard hadn't asked how it ended up there. He simply opened it, hands trembling. "My love, if I'm no longer here, forgive me for leaving you with the children. I know you are strong, but I also know you are so very lonely. Find someone who can love the three of you quietly. She doesn't need to be perfect, only gentle, only patient." Richard's vision blurred. How long had it been since he cried? He had thought his tears had dried the day he buried Eleanor. Outside, Maria was tending to the lavender beds near the children's balcony. The wind tugged softly at her dark brown hair as she trimmed each stem with calm precision. Elise sat on a blanket stringing beads. Caleb clutched her sleeve. No words, no laughter, and yet something in the air had shifted. Maria never rushed. She simply gathered up the broken fragments of their days, tidying dreams that had shattered, mending emotions left scattered, and, piece by piece, she was teaching the children how to trust warmth again. That evening, Richard lingered outside the twins' bedroom door. Through the crack, he watched Maria telling a story without words. Her hands moved in soft arcs, illustrating pictures from the book in her lap. Caleb's eyes followed intently. Elise leaned against her shoulder. The golden lamp washed over all three of them, and for a fleeting moment it looked like family. A sigh escaped his chest. Richard turned away, walking slowly back to his study. For the first time in years, he unlocked the small safe hidden in the corner and spread old photographs across the desk. Grace and him beneath the snowfall. Caleb and Elise's first birthday back when they still knew how to laugh. And one photo he hadn't noticed before, Maria, faintly in the background, on her very first day at the house. Now, placed side by side, the images looked less like fragments of separate lives and more like pieces of a river flowing toward the same shore. That night, Richard wrote a letter of his own. Not to send. A letter for Eleanor. A letter for himself. "My love, I was angry at you for so long for leaving me behind. But now I understand some things are beyond choosing. I closed my heart for too many years. But tonight, I saw Elise smile when Maria touched her hand. I saw Caleb lift his eyes when she played piano. You once told me those moments would return, no matter how long it took. Perhaps you were right. Perhaps you sent her to us." He slipped the letter into the same old book, placing it beside Eleanor's. 2 letters, one never sent, one never meant to be resting together in silence. The next morning, Richard didn't go into the city. He walked with Caleb through the garden, the first time the boy allowed himself to hold anyone's hand besides his sister's. Elise painted with watercolors, Maria sitting nearby, offering gentle suggestions. From a distance, Richard saw a small beam of sunlight piercing through the fog of grief. That day, for the first time, Richard cooked breakfast himself. A simple meal: eggs, toast, fruit. Everyone looked stunned. Maria chuckled softly, eyes wide with surprise, watching the billionaire fumble with an apron. Caleb ate every bite. Elise handed her spoon to her father, asking him, without words, to feed her. Richard nearly broke down. His daughter hadn't asked him for that kind of closeness since Eleanor's death. Later that night, Richard stood on the balcony, the hall dimly lit. Below, Maria sat in the garden, reading, a cup of tea in one hand, the other resting in her lap, folded loosely like a prayer. Richard couldn't see the title of the book, but he knew if Eleanor were alive, she would smile and say, "You know, healing often comes from the smallest things, like someone quietly straightening a pair of shoes, like the first hug after long silence, or like the courage of a person who dares to step through their own darkness just to reach for someone else." And as the night air curled around him, Richard felt his eyes sting with tears once more. The sound of piano keys drifted through the stillness of a Sunday afternoon, soft as mist, fragile as breath. Maria wasn't seated at the main bench. She only let her fingers brush across the keys, pressing a few scattered notes before pausing. Her eyes closed for a moment, as if reaching back to some distant memory. The children weren't there. Richard wasn't either. It was just Maria and the old Steinway in the main living room, covered for years with a cloth, once the beating heart of the house. She didn't know what song she was playing. It wasn't written anywhere, just something rising unconsciously, maybe buried in her chest since the day her mother died. Maria had grown up in El Paso, Texas dry winds, hard soil. Her mother had been the church music teacher, and the first piano Maria ever touched wasn't much different from this one-edged, slightly uneven, but full of memory. Richard hadn't meant to eavesdrop. He was only passing by on his way to the library when the melody stopped him in his tracks. There was something hauntingly close to the songs Eleanor used to play on cold winter nights. Not the same notes, not the same precision, but the same feeling. He froze in the doorway, watching the afternoon light pour across Maria's back. She didn't notice him. Her face was calm, her body rising and falling with each breath of the piano. No makeup, no performance, no show. Just a woman touching her loneliness with music. Then tiny footsteps. Maria looked up. Caleb stood there, curls falling into his dark eyes, staring without blinking. Elise followed, padding across the floor until she reached the bench. Then, without a word, she pressed one single key, middle C. Maria blinked, surprised. Richard held his breath, and then Caleb quiet. Hesitant, Caleb sat beside his sister. He didn't speak, didn't gesture, but for the first time, Richard saw his son willingly reach toward sound. Maria didn't cheer. She didn't overwhelm the moment. She simply nodded once, then shifted into a simpler tune, Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, slow and clear, one note at a time. Elise giggled, tapping the keys, glancing up at Maria for approval each time she got it right. From the far side of the room, Richard slid quietly into a chair. He didn't want to disturb the fragile miracle unfolding in front of him. His children were interacting with the world, not hiding from it, not forced, not commanded, just music, and a patience that had no name. That night, dinner felt different. Elise tugged at Mariah's sleeve, babbling with excitement about the piano game. Caleb didn't isolate himself like usual, and Richard, who always rose from the table too soon, lingered this time. He even poured another cup of tea. "Maria," he asked quietly, "how long have you played piano?" She hesitated. "Since I was 7, but I had to stop when I started working, and yet you still remember everything." Her voice softened, "Not with my hands, with my heart." Richard stared at her, struck silent. He had never heard anyone speak of music that way, especially not someone the world might call just the help. But Maria wasn't just that anymore. Elise knew it, Caleb knew it, and deep down, Richard knew Eleanor would have known it too. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He opened old videos on his laptop, Eleanor at the piano, her singing softly for Caleb, Elise clapping in her lap, eyes wide with joy. The house used to be alive with music, with laughter, with stories told through song. After Eleanor's death, he'd locked the piano, nearly had it removed. Music had hurt too much. It made him remember, and remembering felt like bleeding. But tonight the memories didn't cut. They lingered like gentle rain tapping glass, like Mariah's melody, imperfect, but full of soul. The next morning, Richard went looking for her. He found her in the lavender garden, trimming stems like always. When she noticed him, her face showed mild surprise. "Would you," he hesitated, his voice almost a whisper, "teach Caleb and Elise the piano?" Maria froze. Her eyes widened. "I am not a teacher." "I don't need a teacher," Richard said firmly, though his voice cracked with emotion. "I need someone they trust." Silence. The morning breeze carried the scent of fresh grass and dew. Mariah's eyes softened, and slowly, very slowly, she nodded. "Then where do we begin?" she asked. Richard smiled. A real smile, unforced, the first in months. "From Middle C," he said. "I think that's a good place to start." The late afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows, scattering golden ribbons of light across the wooden floor. Richard stood by the glass, a cup of untouched black tea in his hand. From somewhere down the hall, the piano hummed softly. Elise's laughter rang out, light and musical, followed by Caleb's slow, careful reading of a children's book. 3 months ago, Richard never would have imagined hearing such sounds in his home again. That night, after the children had gone to bed, he asked Maria to stay in the living room. It wasn't the command of an employer to an employee, but a simple, gentle request. "I'd like to know more about you," he said quietly, "if you're comfortable." Maria was silent for a long moment. In the glow of the warm lamp, her eyes seemed veiled with a soft mist. Finally, she nodded. "My daughter's name was Sophia," she began, her voice slow, as though she were carefully touching each memory. "She was 7, brown hair, one dimple on her cheek. She didn't sing loudly, but her voice was clear as a silver bell. She loved to draw flowers, and she hated carrots." Richard didn't interrupt. He simply listened. "My husband died young. It was just me and Sophia. I worked at a shelter for abandoned children in New Mexico. Sophia grew up surrounded by other kids, and she shared everything she had, her cookies, her crayons, even her hugs." Maria pulled a folded handkerchief from her pocket and dabbed at her eyes. She wasn't crying. Not exactly. Her eyes just looked deeper, saltier, like the sea after rain. 3 years ago, while I was on a night shift, Sophia was hit by a car that ran a red light right outside her school. The police said she passed almost instantly. No pain, but for me, everything was gone. Richard felt his chest tighten. He'd never imagined that this quiet, steady woman carried such a wound. After that, I went back to work, until one night, I found a little girl, 3 years old, being abused at the shelter. I reported it. My supervisors ignored it. I pushed harder, demanded an investigation, protection for the children, and then they let me go, said I was causing trouble. Maria lifted her head, meeting his eyes. There was no bitterness there, no demand for justice. Just a woman telling her story the way one might describe a passing storm, painful, inevitable, endured. I didn't come here to replace anyone, she said softly, and I didn't come to save anyone either. I just saw the same look in Elise and Caleb's eyes that I once saw in Sophia's. And I thought if I could do even a little for them, maybe Sophia could rest easier, wherever she is. Richard set his cup down, his hand gripping the arm of his chair. A part of him wanted to reach across the room to hold her not from pity, but from understanding. Instead, he whispered, "You've saved them, and you've saved me too." Maria smiled faintly. "No, they saved me." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was deep, like a shared language that needed no words. Then Richard seemed to remember something. He rose, walked to the bookshelf, and pulled down a small wooden box. Inside were letters Eleanor had left behind. His voice dropped, slower now. "You know, I never finished reading these after Eleanor died. Last night, I opened one, and I found this." He handed her a page. Eleanor's slanted handwriting still vivid despite the years. In it, Eleanor had written to thank the shelter where Maria once worked for caring for children the world overlooks but who are infinitely valuable. At the bottom, she had written transfer $20,000 every quarter, anonymously, to support the center's operations. The date read April 2021. Maria froze. She had never known who stood behind those anonymous donations. But now, the pieces fell into place like an unseen hand had been stitching two lives together all along. Maybe Richard said quietly, "Eleanor and you never met, but you both believed in the same thing." Mariah's eyes shimmered. She whispered, almost to herself, that no child is invisible. That night, Richard didn't bury himself in work. He sat in Eleanor's old study, surrounded by her books and photos, thinking about the strange way life weaves people together. A widower, a mother who had lost her child, and two children who had once seemed lost in silence forever. Maybe Eleanor hadn't truly left. Maybe through Mariash was still here, not to repeat what was gone, but to heal what remained. That night, the sky raged, thunder cracked across the Hamptons, tearing apart the silence of midnight. Rain hammered the roof like 1,000 fists pounding on memory. Richard was in the library, a book in hand, when a frantic knock broke the quiet. It was Maria, her face pale. "Caleb has a fever. Very high," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "I think it's up to 104. Richard's heart slammed in his chest. Without a word, he rushed upstairs. Caleb lay curled on the bed, his skin burning, lips dry, whispering incoherent words. Elise sat beside him, clutching her teddy bear, eyes wide with fear. Maria followed close behind, already holding cool cloths and fever medicine. "We need to bring his temperature down now," she instructed quickly. "Wipe his forehead and under his arms. He'll get warm water. Not cold water could trigger seizures. Richard obeyed every word, clumsy but desperate, like a man learning fatherhood for the first time. He had signed billion-dollar contracts, commanded empires, but now, every bead of sweat on his son's brow felt heavier than the world. Elise clung to his arm, terrified of losing her brother. Thena, deafening crack of thunder. The power went out. Darkness swallowed the room, leaving only the faint glow of Maria's flashlight. "He'll get candles," she said, hurrying off, but a sudden cry pierced the night. Elise pointed toward the doorway. Caleb's breathing too fast, she shouted. Richard's gaze shot down. Caleb's chest rose and fell in sharp bursts, the fever unrelenting. His hands shook. He had never felt so powerless. Then another noise. From the next room. Small footsteps, a thud. Aiden Mariah's voice echoed from downstairs. Elise's tiny finger pointed toward the hall. Richard bolted out. In the dim flicker, he saw Aiden, his quietest child standing by the upstairs window. His little legs trembled, but he was standing, walking on his own for the first time since learning to walk. The window was ajar, wind whipping his hair into a wild tangle. He pressed his forehead against the glass, staring into the storm. Another thunderclap shook the house. Aiden flinched, losing balance, tipping backward. Richard lunged, catching him just before his head hit the table's edge. The boy trembled, burying his face in Richard's chest. And then it happened. A sound, the smallest sound in the universe, fragile, shaking, but clear. Dad. Richard froze. In that instant, the storm outside vanished. The empire, the deals, the burdens all dissolved. There was only one word. One sacred word that outweighed the universe. Dad. Tears spilled down his cheeks, not from fear but from the overwhelming truth. For the first time, he wasn't just a provider, not just the man arranging nannies in schools. He was a father cousin, trusted, called by name. Maria rushed in, a candle in her hand. She stopped, stunned by the sight, the flickering glow casting shadows on father and son. She placed the candle down silently and reached out, gently brushing the tears from Richard's face. Aiden's breathing slowed. Elise ran over, wrapping her arms around Richard's leg. From the other room, Caleb's weak voice broke through the fevered haze. Daddy Richard looked at Maria. No words. None were needed. In their eyes, an unspoken truth that this was no longer a mansion haunted by loss, no longer a place of employer and servant. This was a family, born not of blood but of love and healing. Outside, the storm still raged, but inside, the glow of a few small candles and the warmth of a single word had worked a miracle. It was a crisp spring morning, and the Alton estate was awash with light. Sunbeams streamed through tall glass windows, painting golden ribbons across polished wood floors. In that glow, Elise twirled around the living room in a floral dress, clutching a small sign that read, "Welcome Sophia and Eleanor Foundation." Across the room, Caleb carefully pinned family photos onto a display board, his eyes bright with pride. Richard stood behind them in a simple gray suit, his chest tight with emotion, not because of the foundation launch about to begin, but because of what he was witnessing, something he once believed impossible. A year ago, his children barely spoke, barely moved, and now they were alive again. They were laughing, creating, living, and none of this would have been possible without Maria. "You ready?" a gentle voice asked from behind him. He turned. Maria stood there, no longer in her housekeeper's uniform, but in a simple, elegant white coat. There was calm in her eyes, but also a hint of shyness, as though she was still adjusting to this new role. Richard stepped closer and nodded softly. "Thank you for not giving up on them, on me." Mariah's eyes shifted to the children, a faint smile on her lips. "The truth is, they're the ones who never gave up on me." The ceremony was simple, held in the back garden where Eleanor once grew lavender and wild daisies. Wooden chairs lined the grass, a small gathering of close friends, longtime partners, and representatives from children's shelters seated quietly. Richard took the podium, clutching an old photo Eleanor, radiant, cradling their newborn twins. "Today," he began slowly, "we honor my wife Eleanor, the woman who taught me what love looks like. But we also honor another mother, Sophia, a little girl who is no longer here, but whose memory continues to shape lives. From their loss, something new has taken root." He introduced the Eleanor and Sophia Foundation, a home of hope for children who've lost parents, a place that would provide therapy, education, and safety for those society often forgets. "And there's no one more fitting to lead this foundation," Richard continued, his voice thick with emotion, "than Maria Reyes, the woman who pulled my children out of silence, out of darkness, and, in many ways, saved me too." The garden fell into stillness. Maria stepped forward. For a few seconds, she said nothing, scanning the faces of people who had only ever known her as a housekeeper. Now, she stood as someone entrusted with a mission. "I once lost a child," she began quietly, "and I know the pain of feeling unseen, unheard. But standing here, I realize my daughter Sophia never truly disappeared. She sent me here. She gave me the chance to love again." The applause that followed wasn't loud. It was tender, respectful like the journey itself. Later that afternoon, a private jet waited on the tarmac at a small Long Island airfield. But this wasn't for business, not for meetings or deals. Yellowstone. Richard smiled. "Eleanor always dreamed of taking the kids there. It's time I finally keep that promise." Caleb and Elise raced up the steps, hand in hand. Maria followed with a small canvas bag inside, her daughter Sophia's old journal and a few worn fabric toys. Richard lingered for a moment at the bottom of the stairs, gazing at the three of them with a heart full of gratitude. Then he followed, the cabin doors sealing shut. As the engines roared to life, Elise spun around, her eyes sparkling. "We're ready," she and Caleb said together. Maria squeezed Elise's hand. Richard turned away, brushing a tear from his cheek. Outside, the sky stretched wide and endless. The jet lifted, carving westward toward the forests of Yellowstone, toward rivers that glistened like glass, trails waiting for new footsteps, and the promise of a family beginning again. And as the screen faded, a soft narration lingered in the mind of every listener. Family isn't just what you're born into. It's what you choose, what you nurture, what you save with love, with courage, with the little moments that turn out to mean everything. There are losses that money can never heal. There are silences in a child's heart that even time cannot mend. And yet sometimes, the simple presence of one person quiet, humble, almost invisible, can awaken an entire life. The story of Richard Alton, his twins, and the woman named Maria is not just a journey from pain to healing. It's living proof of this truth. Love, patience, and sincerity have never lost their power, even in a world where it feels like everything has a price. too often. We judge people by the roles they play, the boss, the housekeeper, the broken child. We forget that every heart knows how to love, and that every person can be a miracle to someone else. My hope is that after hearing this story, you'll pause just for a moment. Look around at the people near you. You might be closer to something beautiful than you realize. All it takes is opening your heart. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. If this story gave you even a small spark of hope or helped you see life in a new way, please like, share, and let this message reach someone who may need it. And don't forget to subscribe so we can keep walking together through the stories that move us. Wishing you peace and love in this life.